It's been a great conference. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'd like to thank ICEERS and all the great people here. A lot of very interesting talks, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to get up on this stage after these great speakers. Last two people we just heard were wonderful. A long time ago, I spent a couple years living with Ashaninka people in the Peruvian Amazon. I wanted to study how these people use the rainforest. At first, I didn't pay much attention to what they thought of me because I'd come to study them and not the other way around. But I soon realized that they too had an eye on me. The young people in the community that I was living in spoke Spanish on top of their mother tongue, and this allowed us to communicate freely. And one day I was hanging out with some young Ashaninka, and they were asking questions about where I came from, like, what's it like in your land? And where is your land? And in response, I began talking about a round planet on which we all lived, and I noticed some puzzled looks. So I launched into an explanation about what I understood about the movement of planets, and I grabbed a grapefruit and a lemon, and I started miming the rotation of the Earth around the sun. And at one point, I indicated one side of the lemon and said, and this is Europe, where I live. And then I pointed to the other side of the lemon and said, this is the Peruvian Amazon, where we are now. And the young Ashaninka listened to this demonstration in silence, and when I was done, they continued saying nothing. Well, in the months that followed, I came to understand that the Ashaninka community had a different point of view on the matter. And in their view, white people like myself, Viracocha in Ashaninka, or Gringos in Spanish, come from a level situated below where the Ashaninka live. And we live underground, which is why our skins are so pale. And we live in vast cities filled with sophisticated technologies, and we occasionally access the level at which the Ashaninka live by passing through lakes. And we come up to capture Ashaninka women and children to extract the fat from their bodies, which we turn into a fine oil that we need to run our machines and the motors of our airplanes. I came to realize that the people with whom I was living considered that I was a potential pistaco, or white vampire, bent on killing people and extracting their body fat. Well, I initially found it disturbing that people could think of me in this way. And then I realized that it was an appropriate metaphor for the historical behavior of Westerners in the Amazon. In the 16th century, the first conquistadors had killed and destroyed to extract gold to take back to their countries. And since then, the pattern has remained the same as Westerners have come to extract rubber, oil, wood, minerals. So, for the Ashaninka, it was clear that I was a gringo, white. But I also had blue eyes, fair hair, and a beard, and this just happened to be the exact characteristics ascribed to Pishtacos. So, from their perspective, I certainly looked like a Pishtaco. So it seemed reasonable to think that I'd come to extract something. On several occasions, individual men in the community took me aside and told me that they knew of nearby gold deposits that they'd be willing to show me. I would respond to these propositions with indifference, much to their surprise. A gringo, uninterested in gold? Was this possible? The people in the community regularly ask me questions about the world of gringos. And one question in particular kept cropping up. Why is it that gringos never have enough wealth? You can give them gold, they'll only want more. Why? In their point of view, gringos were obsessed with extraction and accumulation. I became accustomed to living with them and them seeing me like this. It was true that, for example, they had a fascination for the objects I owned. And they tirelessly asked me questions about them, like, so how do you make rubber boots with leather linings? Or a Swiss Army knife? Or a portable tape recorder? I was perhaps a Pishtaco, but I had fascinating merchandise. And this fascination with the merchandise of Westerners extends across different Amazonian indigenous groups. The Piro people in the Peruvian Amazon call white people in their language owners of objects. And the Yanomami people call white people in the Brazilian Amazon call white people people of the merchandise. So, living with Ashaninka people, I became used to them seeing me as a Pishtaco obsessed with extraction and accumulation. But I also vowed to try to prove them wrong and try to extract as little as possible and to make myself useful to them. So after a couple of years living with them, I returned home and wrote a dissertation and began working for a humanitarian organization active in the Peruvian Amazon. And over the last 30 years, this work, which is ongoing, has allowed me to meet many different indigenous Amazonian peoples, especially in the Peruvian Amazon. So not just Ashaninka, but Awahun, Shawi, Kukama, Kukamiria, Matsigenka. And to my surprise, I found that all of these people referred to Pishtacos. And one day in 2002, I was traveling with some Awahun people in the northeast of the Peruvian Amazon, and we stopped in at an isolated house in the forest, which was the home of one of the members of our party. And his wife, who was there, began serving bowls of manioc beer. But when she saw me, she went all pale and started shaking, and she couldn't come close enough to me to give me a bowl of beer. And she started saying the word pistaco several times. Well, I saw her husband reprimand her in Awahun, told her to serve me a beer like to anybody else. And then when we resumed our trek, the fellow explained to, I knew we'd known each other for several years. He worked as a bilingual teacher. And he told me that his wife wasn't used to seeing white people, and that her attitude was not ill will. And it was then that I understood that receiving the visit of a gringo pistaco when you weren't used to it was like receiving the visit of Count Dracula himself with his pale skin and blood-tinged teeth. A grim prospect. So I made an effort to consider the following question. Was I truly a white vampire here in the Peruvian Amazon to extract the body fat of indigenous Amazonian people? Well, I was certainly a child of capitalism, rationalism, and materialism. And my ancestors had participated in the development of global capitalism, the wheels of which had been greased by the ruthless exploitation of indigenous Amazonian people. The accounts I'd read of the atrocities committed against indigenous Amazonians during the rubber boom of the 19th and 20th century were pretty terrible. So, from an Amazonian perspective, my culture was certainly pistaco-like, and so, therefore, so was I. The pistaco image became all the more troubling because it was coherent. As a young anthropologist living with Ashaninka people, I had extracted data from them and then turned this data into a dissertation for my personal benefit. Now, as I worked for a humanitarian organization that backed the initiatives of indigenous Amazonian people, such as land titling and bilingual education programs, I felt relieved to be able to partially atone for my past. Reciprocity, I realized, is an antidote to pistacohood. But I did not discourage Amazonian people from considering Westerners as pistacos, obsessed with extraction and accumulation, because I'd come to view the metaphor as essentially true. Well, in the last 20 years, a new generation of Westerners has arrived in the Amazon in search of shamanic experiences and healing. And from an Amazonian perspective, this surprises no one that Gringos should be in search of healing. What's different this time is that they haven't come to extract gold or material wealth, but they want to learn, and they're even willing to pay for it. All this is new. So, what do indigenous Amazonians think about Westerners who come to the Amazon to drink ayahuasca? I put this question to several Amazonian people who work to defend indigenous cultures and languages and who have no direct interest in the ayahuasca economy or in the commerce of medicinal plants. Never Tuesta Cerón, the Awahun director of a training program for bilingual indigenous teachers in Iquitos, Peru, told me that he was optimistic about the new visitors. I think it is good if Europeans come to learn about the knowledge of indigenous peoples, he said. He was open and pragmatic. The only thing he asked was that the visitors follow proper procedures. But he also said that this was just his personal opinion, and so he submitted my question to several indigenous elders who work for the program that he runs and who have been elected by their respective peoples to teach their indigenous language and culture to future teachers in training. And none of the elders who responded objected to Westerners who come to drink ayahuasca, but several found it problematic when the Westerners extracted ayahuasca and took it back to their countries. And I'll just read you a couple of quotes. As Maritza Ramirez Tamani, an elder of the Cucamiria people, said, quote, "That gringos come to drink is inevitable, but what is not good is that they take ayahuasca to drink in other places. They already stole everything we had. It's the last straw that they should also steal our spiritual strength. I would ask the Europeans that they drink, but that they do not take it back to their countries, because this breaks the strength and leaves the maestros weakened." Unquote. Gringos. They're always extracting something. And now it's ayahuasca. Rafael Chanchari Pisuri, an elder of the Shawi people, pointed out a historical injustice at play in this case. Quote, "The religious ancestors of the Europeans came some time ago to tell our grandparents to stop drinking ayahuasca, saying it was satanic work. And so we mainly gave it up. And many people were put to death for having drunk ayahuasca and for having healed people of different diseases. And now Europeans and Americans drink ayahuasca in their cities, protected by human rights. Practically, they took away our knowledge by demonizing ayahuasca among indigenous peoples. They must pay us back or return something to us and ensure that ayahuasca be used for its true objectives, namely healing, protection, and prevention of all kinds of diseases." Unquote. I understand Rafael Chanchari as saying, the cat may be out of the bag, but it's an Amazonian cat, and it comes with a historical debt. And the world's ayahuasca enthusiasts have a debt towards the first peoples who developed the practices they are now drawing from. And as you've been able to tell by listening to previous speakers, the indigenous people of the Amazon are fighting for their survival as indigenous communities across the Amazon are faced with extractive industries, wide-scale deforestation, environmental contamination, and territorial encroachment. in these circumstances, benefiting from the healing of ayahuasca while doing nothing for the people who initially developed the brew and who are in difficult circumstances seems vampiric. So what can well-intentioned ayahuasca drinkers do to diffuse this? Well, one suggestion among many possible suggestions is find an organization near you that backs the initiatives of Indigenous Amazonian people and make a donation every time you drink the brew according to your means and according to what you think the medicine has given you. It turns out that really Indigenous Amazonian people are on the front lines of defending the rainforest. And this is a key issue, not only for them, but for biodiversity, for climate stability, for life on Earth. Satellite imagery proves that rainforest that is legally controlled by Indigenous Amazonians is more intact even than national parks or nature reserves. And yet, Indigenous Amazonian people receive little outside support. So this is an opportunity for ayahuasca drinkers to demonstrate their heightened sensitivities and show solidarity with and reciprocity towards Indigenous Amazonian people. And it's true that there already are some Gringos who have given their lives to ayahuasca, studied it seriously, have ongoing relations with Amazonian people, and do what they do with respect and reciprocity. So some recovering vampires can turn out to be useful allies for Indigenous Amazonians. Well, individual Gringos are one thing. The international scientific community is another. Science has a long history of taking the plants and knowledge of Indigenous Amazonian people and giving little in return. The extraction never stops. And this is vampire science. And it seems to be happening again with ayahuasca. As scientists discover the brew's remarkable properties, very little research is conducted in a dialogue with Indigenous Amazonian people. This is one thing that scientists could return to Indigenous Amazonians, one minimal thing, a recognition that they are worthy partners in dialogue. And I think that a true dialogue with Indigenous Amazonian people would help scientists reach a fuller understanding of ayahuasca. For the moment, many scientists seem to reduce ayahuasca to the DMT it contains and consider it as a form of drinkable DMT or orally active DMT. But Indigenous Amazonians have said from the beginning that the main plant in the brew is the ayahuasca vine itself, which does not contain DMT. The DMT comes from the admixture plants like chacruna. The ayahuasca vine contains the harmala alkaloids, harmine, harmaline, and so on. And it turns out that harmine also generates visuals that are perhaps not as colorful and spectacular as the DMT visuals, but nonetheless. And harmine has anti-inflammatory properties. It helps generate new neurons, and some research shows that it may have antiviral, antimicrobial, antifungal, and anti-tumor properties. So ayahuasca is certainly a complex brew of chemicals, and reducing it to the DMT it contains may be missing the essential. I'd like to mention some interesting research that was reported on yesterday. Hele Kasik and her presentation called What's in the Cup. She took ayahuasca samples across the Amazon, and what she showed was that the indigenous ayahuascas tended to contain much more harmine and much less DMT, whereas the ayahuasca sampled from the neo-shamanic retreat centers were very high in DMT and much lower in the harmine and so forth. It seems that the Gringos really like the DMT fireworks. Well, I've got nothing against the fireworks, but indigenous Amazonian people tend to say that those visuals are not the essential part. There's the purge, of course. There are the revelations, the understanding, the ideas, not necessarily the visuals that are the important part. So more research is certainly needed to reach a full understanding of the ayahuasca brew, and veritable dialogues between scientists and indigenous Amazonians simply make sense. And besides, such dialogues would help scientists de-vampirize their relations with indigenous Amazonians on the sensitive subject of ayahuasca. I'd actually be happy to see at maybe the next ayahuasca conference more dialogues between indigenous people and scientists, where it would be kind of like a debate, and not too many people on the stage, but what does the indigenous shaman have to say? What does the scientist have to say? How can these ways of understanding be brought together? Gracias. In conclusion, I think there is a deep truth to the Pishtaco concept, and Western people tend to end up in vampiric relations with Amazonian people despite their best intentions. And this is due to the power imbalance between the two sides. The problem is that the Westerners stand to extract much more value from the encounter than the Amazonian people do. My life was certainly changed by living with Ashaninka people, much more so than the other way around. And many ayahuasca drinkers say that their time in the Amazon has changed their lives. But what did the Amazonian people who attended to them get out of it? Perhaps some payment, but probably nothing quite so life-changing. Undoing this imbalance and making our relations with Amazonian people more reciprocal is the work of a lifetime. Thank you.